Captain Lisa Grant stood at the window of her quarters aboard the UES Liberty and watched the blue marble of Earth grow larger as her ship approached the orbital station. She had been gone for 18 months on a deep space mission near the Kepler system, and every day of those months had felt like a year. The stars were beautiful, but they were cold and distant and nothing like the warmth of home that she remembered from her childhood in Ohio. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the holographic message device that contained her husband's invitation. Jack Grant had sent her a brief message 3 days ago, asking her to come home for what he called an important family dinner. His voice had sounded strange in the recording, and his eyes had avoided looking directly at the camera. Lisa had watched the message 5 times, trying to understand what was different about the man she had married 12 years ago. The marriage had been good in the beginning, when they were both young and full of dreams about exploring the galaxy together. Jack had been a colonial administrator back then, and Lisa was just starting her career as a space officer with the United Earth Command. They had met at a diplomatic function on Mars where Jack was representing the colonial government, and Lisa was part of a military escort detail. Jack had been charming and funny, and he made her laugh in ways that no one else ever had. But things changed when Lisa got promoted to captain and started taking longer missions into deep space. Jack complained that she was never home and that he felt like he was married to a ghost. He said that she loved the stars more than she loved him, and maybe he was right about that. The stars never argued with her or made her feel guilty for doing her job. The stars were constant and reliable, and they never asked her to choose between duty and love. Their house in New Geneva Colony was exactly as she had left it, except for the dust that had settled on everything during her absence. The furniture was the same and the pictures on the walls were the same, but something felt different. Lisa could not put her finger on what it was, but the house felt like a museum of their past rather than a home where people actually lived. Jack was waiting for her in the living room when she arrived at exactly 7 o'clock as he had requested. He was pacing back and forth across the carpet, and his hair was messy, like he had been running his hands through it. He looked older than she remembered, and there were lines around his eyes that had not been there when she left. He was wearing his best shirt and his good pants like this was some kind of special occasion. Next to him stood a young woman that Lisa had never seen before. She was pretty in a quiet way with dark hair and kind eyes, and she looked nervous. The woman was wearing a simple blue dress that could not quite hide the fact that she was pregnant. Her hands kept moving to her belly in the way that pregnant women do when they want to protect their unborn child. Lisa felt something cold settle in her stomach as she looked at the scene in front of her. Jack was still pacing, and the young woman was watching him with concern in her eyes. There was an intimacy between them that Lisa recognized even though she did not want to. It was the same way that she and Jack used to look at each other in the early days of their marriage. Jack finally stopped pacing and turned to face his wife. His face was pale and his hands were shaking slightly. Lisa could see that he was trying to work up the courage to say something difficult, and she already knew that she did not want to hear whatever it was. The young woman stepped forward slightly and placed her hand on Jack's arm in a gesture that was both comforting and possessive. Lisa noticed that the woman was wearing a small silver ring on her right hand that caught the light from the ceiling fixtures. It was not a wedding ring, but it was clearly something that meant something to both of them. Jack cleared his throat and looked directly at Lisa for the first time since she had walked into the room. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke, and Lisa had to strain to hear him over the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. "Lisa, this is Amy Chen," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the words. "She is going to have my baby. We have been together for 8 months and I want to marry her. I want a divorce from you so that I can start a new life with someone who will actually be here." The words hit Lisa like a physical blow, and she felt her knees go weak. She had known that their marriage was in trouble, but she had not expected this. She had not expected to come home from 18 months of serving her planet and her species only to find that her husband had replaced her with someone younger and prettier and more available. Amy looked down at her feet, and Lisa could see that the young woman was uncomfortable with the situation. She probably had not wanted to be part of this confrontation, but Jack had insisted on doing it this way. Lisa wondered if Amy knew about all the lonely nights that Jack had spent calling her on the ship and telling her how much he missed her. She wondered if Amy knew about the promises that Jack had made about their future together. Lisa stood very still for a long moment, and tried to process what she had just heard. Part of her wanted to scream, and part of her wanted to cry, and part of her wanted to walk out the door and never come back. But she was a military officer, and she had been trained to stay calm under pressure even when her whole world was falling. Apart, Jack was watching her face carefully, and she could see that he was expecting her to react with anger or tears or pleading. He probably thought that she would beg him to reconsider or promise to leave the space service and stay home with him. He probably thought that she would fight for their marriage the way that wives were supposed to do in the old stories. But Lisa had something that Jack did not know about. She had information that would change everything about this conversation, and about their lives, and about the future of every human being in the galaxy. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope that contained papers that she had hoped she would never have to show to anyone. "Before you say anything else, Jack," she said in a voice that was perfectly calm and controlled, "I think you need to see these papers first." Jack stared at the envelope in Lisa's hand and frowned. He had expected tears or anger or pleading, but not this calm professional demeanor that she was showing him. This was the same expression that she wore when she was dealing with difficult situations on her ship, and it made him feel like he was just another problem that needed to be solved. "What is that?" he asked, and reached for the envelope with hands that were still trembling, slightly from the confession he had just made. The envelope was made of heavy official paper, and it had multiple seals on it that indicated it was classified military correspondence. Jack had seen enough government paperwork in his job as a colonial administrator to recognize the difference between routine communications and something that was marked as highly sensitive. "Open it," Lisa said, and her voice was still perfectly controlled. She stood with her feet slightly apart and her hands clasped behind her back in the military stance that she used when she was giving orders to her crew. Amy moved closer to Jack and looked over his shoulder as he broke the seals and pulled out several sheets of paper that were covered with official letterheads and classification stamps. Jack's face went from confusion to disbelief to absolute terror as he read through the documents. His skin became pale and his breathing became shallow, and Amy had to grab his arm to steady him when he started to sway. The papers fell from his hands and scattered across the floor like leaves in a windstorm. "This cannot be real," Jack whispered, and his voice was barely audible. Amy knelt down and gathered up the papers and began reading them herself. Her face went through the same progression of emotions as Jack's had, and Lisa could see the exact moment when the full meaning of the documents hit her. "What is it?" Amy asked, and her voice was small and frightened. She was holding one hand against her belly as if she could protect her unborn child from whatever threat was described in those papers. Lisa looked at both of them and felt a mixture of sadness and grim satisfaction. She had not wanted to reveal this information in this way, but Jack had forced her hand with his confession about Amy and the baby. Now they would all have to deal with the reality of what was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. "Those are orders from Earth Central Command," Lisa said, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent years commanding crews in dangerous situations. They were classified until 3 days ago, when all senior officers received updated intelligence briefings. "Long-range sensors have detected an alien fleet approaching our solar system. They will arrive in approximately 14 days. Jack picked up one of the papers with shaking hands and read it again, as if he could not believe what he was seeing. The document was signed by Admiral Carter himself, and it contained details about fleet movements and evacuation protocols and casualty estimates that made his stomach turn. "An alien fleet," he repeated, and the words sounded strange and unreal coming from his mouth. "How many ships, and what do they want? And why was this kept secret from the colonial governments?" Lisa moved to the window and looked out at the peaceful streets of New Geneva Colony, where people were going about their normal evening routines, without any idea that their entire way of life was about to end. Children were playing in the parks, and couples were walking hand in hand, and shopkeepers were closing their stores for the night. None of them knew that in 2 weeks they might all be dead. 67 ships according to our best intelligence," Lisa said without turning around. "The largest fleet that has ever been detected in human space. They belong to something called the Hegemony, which is a collective of alien species that has been conquering worlds in the Andromeda Galaxy for the past 1,000 years. Our deep space reconnaissance teams have been monitoring their expansion for 3 years." Amy stood up slowly and moved to stand beside Jack. She was holding the papers against her chest like a shield, and her face was white with shock. "But what do they want?" she asked. Maybe they just want to make contact or establish trade relations or share technology with us. Lisa turned around and looked at them both with eyes that had seen too much during her years in space. She had read the classified reports about what the hegemony did to the worlds they conquered, and she knew that there would be no negotiations or diplomatic solutions. The aliens were not coming to Earth to make friends. They do not negotiate, Lisa said flatly. They do not take prisoners, and they do not leave survivors. Every world they have encountered has been either completely subjugated or completely destroyed. Based on our intelligence, they view other species as either useful slaves or obstacles to be eliminated. Earth and all colonial worlds have been marked for what they call biological cleansing. The room fell silent except for the sound of Amy's quiet sobbing and the distant hum of the colony's atmospheric processors. Jack sat down heavily in his chair and put his head in his hands. All of his plans for a new life with Amy and their baby suddenly seemed incredibly small and meaningless in the face of species extinction. "Why are you telling us this?" Lisa Jack asked without looking up. "After what I just told you about Amy and the baby, why would you share classified information with us instead of just walking away and letting me deal with the consequences of my choices?" Lisa moved away from the window and sat down across from them. For the first time since she had arrived, her military composure cracked slightly and Jack could see the pain in her eyes. She was not just a captain delivering bad news to civilians. She was a wife who had just learned that her husband was leaving her for another woman on what might be the last day of human civilization. Because, despite everything, you are still the father of Katie, even though she is away at university on Mars, Lisa said quietly. Because this colony and these people matter to me, even if our marriage does not matter to you anymore. And because if these are humanity's final days, I would rather we face them with truth instead of lies and betrayal. Amy wiped her eyes and looked at Lisa with something that might have been respect. She had expected anger and jealousy from the woman whose husband she had stolen, but instead, she was seeing strength and dignity that made her feel ashamed of her own role in this situation. "What happens now?" Amy asked. "Do we evacuate, or do we fight, or do we just wait here and hope that somehow the military can stop them?" Lisa pulled out her personal communication device and activated a holographic display that showed the current positions of all human military forces. The display was filled with blue dots representing Earth ships and red dots representing the approaching alien fleet. Even to an untrained eye, it was obvious that humanity was badly outnumbered. "We fight," Lisa said simply. "Every available ship and every trained officer, and every resource we have is being mobilized for what the strategists are calling the last stand. I have been assigned to command the 3rd Fleet as part of Operation Defiant Shield. We launch in 6 days. Jack looked up at his wife and really saw her for perhaps the first time in years, not just as the woman who chose space over home, but as one of the few people standing between humanity and extinction. The divorce papers that he had prepared earlier that day suddenly seemed like artifacts from a different world where personal problems mattered more than survival. "Lisa, you cannot go out there," Jack said, and his voice was filled with fear. "Those aliens have conquered half of another galaxy, and they have weapons and technology that we cannot even understand. It will be suicide for you and everyone in your fleet." Lisa stood up and straightened her uniform jacket. She had made her choice years ago when she swore an oath to protect Earth and all of its colonies, and she was not going to break that oath now, even if it meant leaving behind a husband who no longer loved her and a life that no longer existed. "Maybe it will be suicide," she said calmly. "But someone has to try, and I would rather die fighting than live, knowing that I did nothing when my species needed me most." "The papers are on the table, Jack. Read them carefully because your life and Amy's life and the life of your unborn child depends on understanding what is coming." The shipyards orbiting Earth became scenes of frantic activity as engineers worked to implement Amy's discoveries into practical weapon systems. Lisa stood on the observation deck of the UES Liberty and watched as her ship underwent modifications that would have been unimaginable just days earlier. Where conventional torpedo tubes had once been installed, workers were now mounting devices that looked more like oversized water cannons than military hardware. Amy was everywhere, at once consulting with weapons designers and explaining the precise molecular interactions that made water lethal to hegemony biology. She had not slept for more than 3 hours at a time since Admiral Carter had accepted her research, and her face showed the strain of being suddenly thrust into the center of humanity's war effort. But her eyes burned with determination as she watched her theoretical knowledge being transformed into practical weapons of war. The first test firing took place in a controlled environment using biological samples that had been preserved from previous reconnaissance missions. When a small amount of pressurized water struck the hegemony tissue, the reaction was immediate and devastating. The alien cells began breaking down within seconds, and within minutes the sample had dissolved into a puddle of harmless organic compounds. Jack coordinated the logistics of retrofitting 400 ships in less than a week and discovered that his years of managing colonial supply chains had prepared him perfectly for the challenge. He worked 18-hour days organizing the delivery of specialized equipment to shipyards across the solar system and ensuring that every vessel in the human fleet would be equipped with water-based weaponry before the alien fleet arrived. The transformation was not limited to weapon systems. Amy's research had revealed that hegemony forces were vulnerable to water in all its forms, and military planners began developing tactics that would exploit this weakness in every possible way. Ships were equipped with systems that could create massive clouds of water vapor in space, while fighters carried payloads that could turn asteroid ice into deadly projectiles. Lisa found herself at the center of strategic planning sessions, where the entire doctrine of space warfare was being rewritten. Traditional tactics that emphasized armor and firepower were replaced with strategies that focused on mobility and the strategic deployment of humanity's most abundant resource. For the first time since receiving her orders, she began to believe that the coming battle might be winnable. The revelation of hegemony vulnerability had effects that went far beyond military planning. Scientists across human space began examining their understanding of alien biology and questioning assumptions that had guided xenobiological research for decades. If a species could conquer half of another galaxy while being vulnerable to something as simple as water, then clearly there was much that humanity did not understand about the universe. Amy worked with teams of researchers to analyze every scrap of data that had been collected about the hegemony over the past 3 years. They discovered patterns in alien behavior that suddenly made sense when viewed through the lens of water vulnerability. Hegemony forces avoided systems with high water content, and their ships were designed with redundant environmental sealing that now appeared to be protection against atmospheric moisture rather than radiation or vacuum. The implications extended beyond the current crisis. If humanity could survive the coming battle, then Amy's discoveries would form the foundation for an entirely new approach to interstellar relations. Knowledge of alien vulnerabilities could be used for defense rather than conquest and might open up possibilities for peaceful coexistence that had never existed before. Jack found himself working more closely with Lisa than they had in years, as the crisis forced them to collaborate on matters of life and death importance. Their personal problems had not disappeared, but they seemed insignificant compared to the task of organizing humanity's defense against extinction. They developed a professional relationship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to survival rather than the romantic love that had once bound them together. Amy noticed the change in their interactions and felt a complex mixture of emotions about what it meant for her future. She had fallen in love with Jack during a time when he felt abandoned and neglected by his wife, but now she was seeing the man Lisa had originally married. The Jack who threw himself into important work with passion and dedication was very different from the lonely administrator who had sought comfort in her arms. The weapons tests continued around the clock as engineers refined their designs and improved the efficiency of water-based delivery systems. Each successful test brought new understanding of how to maximize the lethal effects of water on hegemony. Biology and military planners began developing increasingly sophisticated tactics for exploiting this vulnerability. Lisa watched the test results with growing confidence and began to envision scenarios where humanity not only survived the coming battle but achieved decisive victory. The psychological impact of discovering such a fundamental weakness in their enemies was transforming the morale of human forces throughout the solar system. Soldiers who had been preparing for a hopeless last stand were now training for a war they believed they could win. The communication networks buzzed with reports from across human space as colonies and outposts began implementing their own versions of water-based defenses. mining stations in the asteroid belt, reported success in converting ice processing equipment into improvised weapons, while agricultural colonies began preparing their irrigation systems for use as emergency defense measures. Amy received reports from research teams on dozens of worlds who were conducting their own experiments with hegemony biological samples. The consistency of the results was overwhelming and left no doubt that water vulnerability was a universal characteristic of alien biology rather than a weakness limited to specific subspecies or variants. Jack coordinated the distribution of new weapons technology to colonial defense forces and marveled at the speed with which human ingenuity was adapting to exploit their enemy's weakness. Engineers who had never designed military equipment were creating weapons systems that surpassed anything in the previous arsenal, while farmers and miners were developing tactics that turned everyday tools into instruments of war. The transformation of human society in response to the crisis was remarkable to witness. People who had been focused on routine civilian concerns just days earlier were now contributing their skills and knowledge to the greatest military effort in human history. The threat of extinction had unified humanity in ways that peacetime politics and diplomacy had never achieved. Lisa began receiving reports from reconnaissance teams who were monitoring the approaching hegemony fleet, and the news was encouraging. The alien ship showed no signs of having detected humanity's new weapons technology and appeared to be proceeding according to standard conquest protocols. They clearly expected to encounter the same types of resistance they had overcome on hundreds of other worlds. Amy worked with intelligence analysts to predict how hegemony forces would react when they discovered that their environmental suits were inadequate protection against weaponized water. The psychological impact of suddenly finding themselves vulnerable to something they had never considered a threat could potentially cause panic and confusion among alien commanders who were accustomed to overwhelming superiority. The final preparations proceeded with clockwork precision as Jack's logistical planning ensured that every ship and every soldier had access to the new weapons technology. Lisa reviewed tactical plans that incorporated water-based warfare into every aspect of the coming battle, while Amy continued refining her understanding of exactly how to maximize the lethal effects of their secret weapon. As the hegemony fleet approached the outer edge of the solar system, humanity was as ready as it could possibly be for a war that would determine the fate of every human life in the galaxy. Amy sank into the nearest chair and placed both hands protectively over her belly as the full weight of Lisa's words settled over her. The baby inside her kicked as if sensing her distress, and she found herself wondering what kind of world she was bringing a child into. 3 days ago, her biggest worry had been telling her parents about the pregnancy, and now she was learning that her baby might never have a chance to see its first birthday. Jack was still staring at the military documents scattered across the coffee table. His administrative mind was trying to process the logistics of what Lisa was describing, but the numbers were too large and too terrible to fully comprehend. 67 alien ships against humanity's entire military force sounded like a mathematical equation with only one possible outcome. Lisa activated her personal holographic display in the living room, filled with a three-dimensional map of local space. Blue dots represented human ships and installations, while red dots showed the approaching hegemony fleet. The red dots were arranged in a precise formation that spoke of military discipline and overwhelming force. Even Amy, who knew nothing about space warfare, could see that the human forces were scattered and outnumbered. The hegemony does not negotiate, and they do not show mercy, Lisa continued as she manipulated the display to show different tactical scenarios. Every world they have encountered has been strip-mined for resources after the native population was eliminated. They view biological diversity as inefficient, and they prefer to replace complex ecosystems with simplified agricultural systems that can feed their growing population. Amy stared at the holographic display and tried to imagine New Geneva. Colony turned into some kind of alien farm. The parks where children played would be gone, and the forests that surrounded the city would be cut down and replaced with whatever crops the aliens preferred. The people she had come to know and care about would simply cease to exist. What about evacuation? Amy asked desperately. Surely there must be some way to get people to safety before the aliens arrive. There are civilian transports and cargo ships that could carry refugees to the outer colonies where they might be able to hide. Lisa nodded, grimly, and adjusted the display to show evacuation, routes leading away from Earth and the major colonial worlds. The routes looked like thin blue lines stretching into the vast emptiness of space, and Amy could see how vulnerable and exposed any evacuation fleet would be. Evacuation. Protocols are already in motion, Lisa said, though her voice suggested that she did not have much hope for their success. Civilian transports will begin departing for the Outer Rim colonies in 72 hours. Priority will be given to children and pregnant women and essential personnel who can help establish new settlements. You are both on the priority list. Jack looked up from the documents with surprise. Both of us, he asked. But I am not essential personnel, and you just learned about Amy tonight, so how could she be on any list? Lisa met his eyes with an expression that was difficult to read. Despite everything that happened between us, you are still my husband and the father of my stepdaughter, she said quietly. That makes you family. And family gets protected even when family does terrible things to each other. As for Amy, she paused and looked at the younger woman with something that might have been curiosity. What exactly do you do for work? Amy, because your identification documents list you as a researcher, but they do not specify what kind of research. Amy shifted uncomfortably in her chair and glanced at Jack before answering. I'm a xenobiologist, she said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. I have been studying alien life forms for the past 6 years, including biological samples that were recovered from hegemony territories by deep space reconnaissance missions. Both Lisa and Jack stared at her in shock. This was the first time that either of them had heard anything about Amy's professional background. Jack had assumed that she was just a colonial citizen, working in some routine administrative job, and Lisa had not bothered to ask about the woman who was carrying her husband's child. You have been studying hegemony biological samples, Lisa said, and her voice carried a new note of intense interest. What kind of samples, and what have you learned about their physiology and biology, and do you know anything about potential weaknesses or vulnerabilities? Amy nodded slowly and seemed to gather confidence as she began talking about her area of expertise. The reconnaissance teams brought back tissue samples and biological waste products, and even some intact organs from hegemony casualties and border skirmishes, she said. I have been working with a team of researchers, trying to understand how their biology works and whether there might be ways to develop countermeasures against biological weapons. Lisa deactivated the holographic display and leaned forward with an expression of intense concentration. This was potentially the most important conversation of her military career, and she needed to hear every detail of what Amy had discovered. What have you found? She asked. What do we know about how they function biologically? Amy took a deep breath and began explaining what 6 years of research had taught her about humanity's enemies. The hegemony species are based on a completely different evolutionary path from Earth life, she said. Their cellular structure uses different chemical processes, and their biology is adapted to environments that would be toxic to most Earth organisms. They require environmental suits to visit worlds with high oxygen content or significant water vapor in the atmosphere. Jack was listening with growing amazement to this revelation about the woman he thought he knew. Amy had never mentioned her work during the 8 months they had been together, and he had never thought to ask. He had been so focused on his own loneliness and resentment toward Lisa that he had failed to learn anything meaningful about the woman he claimed to love. What kind of environmental suits? Lisa asked, and her tactical mind was already beginning to consider the implications of what Amy was telling her. Are they sealed systems, or do they have vulnerabilities that could be exploited in combat situations? Amy hesitated before answering, because she was revealing classified information that could potentially affect military planning. The suits are not perfect, she said finally. They have filtration systems that can be overwhelmed by certain chemical compounds, and they are vulnerable to electromagnetic interference at specific frequencies. But more importantly, they have a critical weakness that Earth has in abundance. Lisa felt her heart rate increase as she sensed that Amy was about to reveal something that could change everything about humanity's prospects for survival. What weakness? She asked. What do they need protection from that Earth has in abundance? Amy looked directly at Lisa and spoke words that would reshape the entire war effort. Water, she said simply. Liquid H2O in its pure form is toxic to their cellular structure at the molecular level. Contact with water causes their cells to break down and their organs to fail within minutes. They can handle water vapor in small concentrations, but direct contact with liquid water is fatal to them. The room fell completely silent as the implications of this revelation sank in. Lisa was staring at Amy with an expression of dawning hope, while Jack was looking back and forth between the two women as if he could not believe what he was hearing. "You are telling me," Lisa said slowly, "that an alien species that has conquered half of another galaxy cannot survive contact with the most common substance on Earth. They are vulnerable to something that covers 70% of our planet's surface and falls from the sky as rain." Amy nodded, and her voice grew stronger as she continued to explain her research. "Every test we conducted showed the same results," she said. "Hegemony biological material breaks down rapidly when exposed to liquid water. Their evolutionary path developed on worlds with different atmospheric compositions, and they never developed resistance to H2O toxicity. It is their fatal weakness, and they know it, which is why they wear environmental suits and avoid worlds with significant water content." Lisa stood up abruptly and began pacing around the room as her mind raced through the tactical possibilities that Amy's revelation had opened up. For the first time since receiving her deployment orders, she began to believe that humanity might actually have a chance to survive the coming war. Jack watched his wife pace and saw something in her expression that he had not seen in years. It was the look of someone who had just been handed the key to solving an impossible problem, and he realized that Amy's knowledge might be more valuable than entire fleets of warships. The woman he had been planning to leave, Lucifer, might have just given humanity the weapon it needed to save itself from extinction. Jack stood up abruptly and began pacing around the living room with an energy that neither Lisa nor Amy had seen from him before. The revelation about Amy's true identity and expertise had transformed his understanding of everything that had happened over the past 8 months, and he was struggling to process the implications of what she had told them. "You have been one of humanity's top biological warfare experts this entire time," he said, and his voice carried a mixture of amazement and confusion. "While I was complaining about feeling lonely and neglected, you were working on research that could save our entire species, and you never told me any of it." Amy watched him pace and felt a complex mixture of guilt and defensive anger. "I could not tell you," she said quietly. "My research was classified at the highest levels, and even having a romantic relationship was a security risk that I had to get cleared through military intelligence. They monitored every conversation. We had to make sure that I did not accidentally reveal sensitive information." Lisa leaned forward with intense interest as she began to understand the larger picture of what had been happening on New Geneva Colony. Amy had not been assigned there by coincidence, and her relationship with Jack had probably been investigated and approved by people much higher up the command structure than a colonial administrator would ever interact with. "How long have you known about the approaching hegemony fleet?" Lisa asked, and her tactical mind was already considering the implications of Amy's knowledge and preparation time. Amy took a deep breath before answering, because she was revealing information that could affect how both of them viewed her motivations and choices. "I have known about the fleet for 6 months," she said. "Long-range sensors detected them while they were still in deep space, and military intelligence began preparing countermeasures immediately. My research was accelerated and given unlimited resources because they knew we would need biological warfare defenses." Jack stopped pacing and stared at her with an expression that was difficult to read. "You knew that we might all be dead in a year, and you started a relationship with me anyway," he said. "You knew that everything we were building together might be destroyed by an alien invasion, and you still let me fall in love with you." Amy felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as she tried to explain choices that seemed impossible to justify now that they were all revealed. "I was lonely too," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was working 18-hour days on research that might save humanity, and I was carrying knowledge that I could not share with anyone outside of my security clearance. When I met you, I found someone who made me feel normal for the first time in years." Lisa watched the exchange between them and felt her anger toward Amy beginning to fade as she understood the impossible situation that the younger woman had been placed in. Military personnel were familiar with the psychological burden of carrying classified information, but civilians like Amy were not trained to handle that kind of isolation and pressure. "The pregnancy was not planned," Amy continued, and now she was crying openly. It happened despite precautions, and when I realized that I was carrying your child, I had to make a choice between telling you the truth about who I was and what I knew, or protecting you from information that could get us both killed. Jack sat down heavily and put his head in his hands, as he tried to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the brilliant scientist who had been working to save their species. Part of him felt betrayed by the deception, but a larger part of him was beginning to understand the impossible position that Amy had been placed in by circumstances beyond her control. "Amy, you should have told me," Jack said finally, and his voice was tired but not angry. "I might not have understood the science or the politics, but I could have supported you through the stress of carrying that responsibility. Instead, you carried it alone while also dealing with an unplanned pregnancy and a relationship with a married man." Lisa felt a strange sense of admiration for Amy as she began to understand the strength and dedication that it must have taken to maintain her cover while conducting research that could determine humanity's fate. The young woman had not just stolen her husband during a moment of loneliness. She had been a soldier in an undeclared war fighting for species survival. "Amy, what exactly have you discovered about hegemony biological weapons?" Lisa asked, because she needed to understand the full scope of what they were dealing with. "You said that you were developing countermeasures, which implies that they have weapons that target biological systems rather than just conventional military technology." Amy wiped her eyes and shifted into the professional mode that she used when discussing her research. "The hegemony uses biological agents that are designed to break down the cellular structure of carbon-based life forms," she said. "They release these agents into planetary atmospheres to eliminate native populations before beginning resource extraction. The agents are specifically engineered to be lethal to Earth-type biology." Jack looked up with horror as he realized what Amy was describing. "They have weapons that can kill every living thing on a planet just by releasing them into the air," he said. "No wonder your research was classified at the highest levels." Amy nodded grimly and continued her explanation. "The biological agents are based on the same cellular chemistry that makes the hegemony vulnerable to water," she said. "Their weapons work by disrupting the molecular bonds that hold Earth-type cells together, but the process requires the same chemical pathways that water interferes with in hegemony biology." Lisa felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place as she understood the connection between Amy's defensive research and her discovery of water vulnerability. The same biological processes that made hegemony weapons effective against Earth. Life also made them vulnerable to countermeasures that exploited their cellular chemistry. "So your discovery of water vulnerability was not accidental," Lisa said. "You found it while developing defenses against their biological weapons and realized that the same chemistry could be used offensively against them." Amy smiled for the first time since the conversation began, and Lisa could see the satisfaction of a scientist whose theoretical work had produced practical results. "Exactly," she said. "I was looking for ways to neutralize their biological agents when I discovered that water disrupts the same molecular processes that their weapons depend on." The defensive research led directly to offensive applications. Jack stood up again, but this time his movement was purposeful rather than agitated. "Both of you are talking about knowledge and weapons that could save humanity," he said, and his voice carried a new note of determination. "Amy, you are one of the few people who understands how to exploit their weaknesses, and Lisa, you are a military commander who knows how to turn scientific discoveries into tactical advantages." Lisa and Amy both looked at him as he continued speaking with growing confidence. "I have been an administrator for 8 years managing supply chains and personnel and resource allocation," she said. "If you are going to fight this war, then you need people who can keep the logistics running and the supplies flowing and the support systems functioning." Amy reached for his hand and squeezed it gently. "Jack, what are you saying?" she asked, though she could already see the answer in his expression. "I am saying that I have been a coward and a fool, but I am still human," Jack said firmly. "Amy is right about humans fighting harder when everything they love is threatened. Lisa is right about humans finding ways to turn defeat into victory. And you are both right that personal problems seem small compared to species extinction." Lisa felt something that might have been pride as she watched her husband find his courage and his purpose in the face of impossible odds. The man who had wanted to divorce her and start over with a younger woman was discovering that there were more important things than personal happiness when survival was at stake. I want to volunteer for whatever assignment will be most useful to the war effort, Jack said. If that means coordinating evacuation logistics, then I will do that. If it means organizing supply lines for the fleet, then I will do that. If it means staying on New Geneva and helping to coordinate planetary defenses, then I will do that too. Amy looked at him with love and respect and something that might have been relief. She had been carrying the burden of her secret knowledge alone for months, and now she had two people who understood the magnitude of what they were facing and were willing to share the responsibility of fighting for humanity's future. Lisa nodded slowly as she realized that the three of them had found a way to transform their personal crisis into something that could contribute to the larger battle for survival. Their broken family had become a team that combined military leadership with scientific expertise and administrative competence. The divorce papers lay forgotten on the coffee table as they began planning how to use their individual skills and knowledge to give humanity the best possible chance of surviving the coming war. Lisa sealed away her holographic displays and looked directly at Jack and Amy as the weight of everything they had learned settled over the room like a heavy blanket. The personal crisis that had brought them together seemed almost trivial now, compared to the species-level threat that was approaching Earth, but she knew that they still needed to address what would happen to their relationships in whatever time they had left. Jack was holding the divorce papers that he had prepared earlier that evening and staring at them as if they were artifacts from a different world where personal problems mattered more than survival. The man who had been so determined to start a new life with Amy just hours ago now seemed uncertain about everything, including his own motivations and desires. Amy sat quietly with her hands resting on her belly and watched both of them with eyes that showed a new understanding of the complexity of their situation. She had come to this dinner expecting to be introduced as Jack's new partner and the mother of his child, but instead she had been thrust into the center of humanity's desperate fight for survival. So here is where we stand, Lisa said, and her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had made difficult decisions under pressure throughout her military career. Jack, you want a divorce so that you can marry Amy and start a new family with her. That is your choice, and I will not fight it even though it hurts more than I can express. Jack looked up from the papers and met his wife's eyes for the first time since she had arrived. He could see the pain that she was trying to hide behind her professional demeanor, and he felt a wave of guilt and regret that threatened to overwhelm him. But you need to understand, Lisa continued, that the papers you would be signing might be meaningless in 2 weeks. Either humanity wins this war and rebuilds civilization from whatever is left, or we all die together, and personal contracts become irrelevant. Marriage and divorce and custody agreements only matter if there is a society left to enforce them. Amy shifted uncomfortably in her chair as she realized that her future with Jack was now dependent on factors completely beyond their control. The baby she was carrying might never be born if the hegemony forces succeeded in their mission of biological cleansing, and even if they survived the war, their world would be changed in ways that none of them could predict. What are our chances? Jack asked, and his voice was quiet with the fear of someone who was beginning to understand the magnitude of what they were facing. Really, what are the odds that any of us will be alive a month from now? Lisa was silent for a long moment as she considered how much truth she should share with civilians who had no military training or experience with the brutal realities of interstellar warfare. But they deserved honesty, even if it was terrifying. The hegemony has superior numbers and more advanced base technology, and centuries of experience conquering other worlds, Lisa said finally. Their ships are larger and better armed than ours, and their soldiers have been bred for warfare across multiple generations. By any reasonable military analysis, we should lose this war. Decisively, should lose, Amy repeated. And there was hope in her voice that suggested she understood that Lisa was about to explain why the analysis might be wrong. But they have never fought humans before, Lisa said, and for the first time since the crisis began, she allowed herself to smile slightly. They have never encountered a species that sends explorers into black holes just to see what happens, or builds colonies on worlds where the atmosphere is poison and the radiation levels would kill most life forms. They do not understand that when you threaten everything a human loves, you do not get a rational response measured in terms of cost and benefit. You get fury made manifest in ways that defy logic and probability. Jack remembered reading about human military history during his education and realized that Lisa was describing something that had been demonstrated repeatedly throughout their species' development. Humans had a documented tendency to fight harder when they were backed into corners and to find victory in situations where defeat seemed inevitable. Amy felt the baby kick inside her as if responding to the conversation about fighting and survival, and she found herself thinking about what kind of world she wanted her child to inherit. A world where humanity cowered before alien conquest, or a world where her species had proven that they could defend themselves against any threat the universe could present. The water-based weapons give us an advantage that the hegemony does not know about. Lisa continued, but we cannot rely on technology alone to save us. Wars are won by people who refuse to give up even when everything seems hopeless, and humans have a long history of finding ways to turn certain defeat into unlikely victory. Jack set down the divorce papers and looked at both women with an expression that showed his internal struggle between personal desires and larger responsibilities. I have been thinking about what you said about evacuation ships and civilian coordinators, he said slowly. If people need to be moved to safety, then someone has to organize the logistics and manage the resources during what could be months of travel. Lisa nodded and waited for him to continue. The evacuation efforts would require people with administrative experience who could handle the complex task of keeping thousands of refugees alive and organized during extended space travel. I want to volunteer for that assignment, Jack said, and his voice grew stronger as he made the decision. I know supply chains and personnel management and crisis coordination. If the worst happens and Earth falls, then someone needs to make sure that human civilization survives somewhere else in the galaxy. Amy looked at him with surprise and something that might have been pride. She had fallen in love with a man who seemed defeated by life and disappointed by his circumstances, but now she was seeing someone who was willing to take responsibility for preserving their species' future. Amy, you should go with the evacuation, Fleet Lisa said gently. Your pregnancy makes you a priority for protection, and your knowledge of hegemony, biology will be invaluable for establishing defenses in whatever worlds humanity manages to reach. Amy was quiet for several minutes as she considered her options. She could accept the safety of evacuation and spend the war hiding in the Outer Rim while other people fought and died for her freedom. Or she could stay and use her expertise to help develop better weapons and tactics, even though it would put both her and her unborn child at risk. Actually, Amy said finally, and her voice was steady, despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. There is something else you both should know about me. Something that might change your recommendations about where I can be most useful. Both Lisa and Jack looked at her with curiosity as she gathered her courage to share information that she had kept private throughout her relationship with Jack. I am not just a xenobiologist working on hegemony samples, Amy said. I am Dr. Amy Chen, and I hold 3 advanced degrees in alien life sciences, and I have been the lead researcher on biological countermeasures for the past 4 years. My sabbatical here on New Geneva was not a vacation. It was a cover assignment while I worked on developing ways to neutralize hegemony biological weapons. The revelation hit both Lisa and Jack like a physical blow as they realized that the woman they thought they knew was actually one of the foremost experts on alien biology and human space. Amy had not just stumbled onto the discovery of water vulnerability through routine research. She had been specifically tasked with finding ways to defend humanity against biological warfare. Lisa felt hope surge through her as she understood the full implications of having Amy's expertise available for the coming battle. Jack stared at the woman he loved with new respect and amazement as he realized that she had been carrying the weight of humanity's survival on her shoulders, while he worried about his personal loneliness and marital problems. The 3 of them sat in silence as they absorbed how completely their understanding of each other and their situation had changed in the space of a single evening. The next 72 hours transformed not just their personal relationships but the entire character of humanity's preparation for war. Lisa activated every communication channel available to her rank and connected Amy directly with the most senior researchers and weapons developers in human space. Within hours, Amy found herself conducting virtual conferences with teams on Earth and Mars and the outer colonies as her research became the foundation for a completely new approach to interstellar warfare. Jack threw himself into coordinating the logistical challenges of retrofitting hundreds of ships with water-based weapon systems while simultaneously organizing evacuation procedures for millions of civilians. His experience managing colonial supply chains proved invaluable as he developed distribution networks that could deliver specialized equipment to shipyards across the solar system in record time. The transformation in their personal dynamics was equally remarkable. Lisa and Amy began working together as colleagues rather than romantic rivals, as they focused on translating biological research into tactical applications. Jack found himself admiring both women for their dedication and expertise while they developed new respect for his ability to solve complex organizational problems under extreme pressure. Amy's research laboratory on New Geneva was converted into a command center where teams of scientists worked around the clock to refine their understanding of hegemony vulnerabilities. She discovered that different water concentrations and temperatures had varying effects on alien biology and that the lethality could be enhanced by adding certain chemical compounds that were abundant in Earth's oceans. Lisa coordinated with fleet commanders throughout human space to develop new tactical doctrines that incorporated water-based warfare into every aspect of military planning. Traditional ship formations were abandoned in favor of strategies that maximized the deployment of weaponized water while minimizing exposure to conventional hegemony firepower. Jack managed the Herculean task of evacuating priority civilians while ensuring that critical personnel remained available to support the war effort. His administrative skills allowed him to balance the competing demands of saving lives and maintaining the industrial capacity needed to continue weapons production. The first test of their new weapons came when long-range patrols encountered hegemony scout ships at the edge of the solar system. Human fighters equipped with water cannons engaged the alien vessels in brief skirmishes that provided crucial intelligence about enemy capabilities and vulnerabilities. The results exceeded even Amy's most optimistic projections as hegemony. Ships suffered catastrophic system failures when their environmental seals were breached by pressurized water. News of the successful encounters spread rapidly through human space and transformed the psychological atmosphere from desperate resignation to confident determination. Soldiers who had been preparing for a hopeless last stand began training with the enthusiasm of people who believed they could actually win the war. Amy received reports from research teams throughout the colonies who were conducting their own experiments with hegemony biological samples and developing localized variations on water-based weapons. The scientific collaboration was unprecedented in human history as researchers shared data and techniques without regard for normal academic competition or proprietary concerns. Lisa found herself promoted to overall tactical coordinator for the defense of Earth as military leaders recognized that her connection to Amy's research made her uniquely qualified to implement water-based warfare strategies. She worked with Admiral Carter to develop battle plans that would exploit every possible advantage that Amy's discoveries had provided. Jack organized supply lines that stretched from Earth to the outer rim colonies and ensured that every human military unit had access to the new weapons technology. His logistics networks became the invisible foundation that supported humanity's transformation from a defensive force into something that could challenge hegemony dominance. The approaching alien fleet showed no signs of awareness that their intended victims had developed weapons specifically designed to exploit their biological vulnerabilities. Intelligence reports indicated that hegemony commanders were proceeding according to standard conquest protocols and expected to encounter the same types of resistance they had overcome on hundreds of other worlds. Amy worked with military psychologists to predict how hegemony forces would react when they discovered that their environmental suits were inadequate protection against weaponized water. The psychological impact of suddenly finding themselves vulnerable to something they had never considered. A threat could potentially cause panic and confusion that would amplify the effectiveness of human tactics. Lisa reviewed intelligence reports about hegemony ship designs and identified critical systems that would be most vulnerable to water-based attacks. The aliens' reliance on sealed environmental systems meant that any breach in their hull integrity could flood their ships with lethal atmosphere and disable their crews within minutes. Jack coordinated with colonial governments to ensure that planetary defenses were equipped with improvised water weapons ranging from modified irrigation systems to pressurized reservoirs that could be released as defensive measures. Even agricultural worlds that had never possessed military equipment were transformed into potential battlegrounds that could resist alien occupation. The final week before the hegemony, Fleet's arrival was marked by frantic activity as every human installation prepared for what military analysts were calling the most important battle in species history. But the mood was no longer one of desperate fear. Amy's discoveries had given humanity hope, and that hope had been transformed into determination and tactical advantage. When the alien fleet finally entered the outer solar system, they found not a cowering species ready for conquest, but humans who had learned to weaponize one of the most common substances in the universe. The first engagement took place near Jupiter, where human ships released massive clouds of water vapor that disabled entire hegemony squadrons before they could mount effective resistance. Battle for Earth became known as the Hydro War, and humanity's victory sent shockwaves through the galaxy that reached civilizations in distant star systems. The species that had conquered half of Andromeda was stopped by beings who had turned their enemy's greatest weakness into their own greatest weapon. In the aftermath of victory, Jack and Amy and Lisa found themselves forever changed by the crisis that had revealed their true characters and capabilities. The divorce papers were never signed, but were instead framed in Lisa's new office as a reminder that even the most devastating personal conflicts could be transformed into strength when people faced impossible challenges. Together, Amy's research became the foundation for humanity's new role in galactic politics as the species that had proven that even the most powerful empires could be defeated by ingenuity and determination and the willingness to fight for survival. Her daughter was born 6 months after the war ended and was named Hope because she represented humanity's future in a galaxy where they had earned their place through courage rather than conquest. Jack became the administrator of the new colonial defense network that used his logistics expertise to ensure that every human world was prepared to defend itself using the lessons learned during the Hydro War. Lisa commanded the exploration fleets that carried human influence into former hegemony territories where they established diplomatic relations based on mutual respect rather than military dominance. Their story became legend throughout human space as proof that personal crisis could be transformed into species salvation when people chose cooperation over conflict and purpose over personal grievance. The family that had been broken by infidelity and neglect became the symbol of humanity's ability to find strength in diversity and hope in the darkest moments of their history. Lisa stopped pacing and turned to face Amy with an intensity that made the younger woman shrink back slightly in her chair. "You need to contact Earth Central Command immediately," Lisa said, and her voice carried the urgency of someone who understood that every minute of delay could cost human lives. "This information has to reach the weapons development teams and the tactical planning divisions before the fleet launches." Amy shook her head and looked down at her hands. "I already tried to get their attention," she said quietly. "I submitted reports and requested meetings and sent detailed analyses of my research to every department that would accept them. But I am just a colonial researcher with no military rank or political connections. My reports got buried in bureaucracy and filed away with thousands of other research papers that nobody has time to read." Jack leaned forward and studied Amy's face as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "You have been carrying this knowledge for months," he said, and there was wonder and disbelief in his voice. "You knew that you had discovered something that could save humanity, and you could not get anyone to listen to you." Amy nodded, and her eyes filled with tears of frustration. "I tried everything," she said. "I contacted military liaisons and scientific review boards and even tried to reach Admiral Carter's office directly. But every time I was told that my research was interesting, but not immediately relevant to current strategic planning. They said that biological warfare countermeasures were a low priority compared to ship construction and fleet deployment." Lisa felt a surge of anger at the bureaucratic blindness that had nearly cost humanity its best chance for survival. Military organizations were notoriously slow to accept new information that contradicted established doctrine, and she could easily imagine Amy's reports disappearing into filing systems that no one ever checked. "That changes now," Lisa said, and she activated her personal communication array with command codes that would give her Direct access to the highest levels of Earth Central Command. Admiral Carter, this is Captain Grant requesting immediate priority communication with Research Division and Weapons Development. I have intelligence that could fundamentally alter our tactical approach to the coming engagement. The holographic image of Admiral Carter appeared in the living room within seconds, and his expression was grim with the weight of commanding humanity's last desperate defense. Captain Grant, the Admiral said, and his voice was tight with stress. I hope you have good news, because the strategic briefings have been uniformly pessimistic about our chances against hegemony forces. Lisa gestured toward Amy, who was sitting frozen with fear at suddenly being thrust into direct communication with the highest levels of military command. Sir, I have with me Dr. Amy Chen, a xenobiologist who has been conducting research on hegemony biological samples. She has discovered a critical vulnerability that we can exploit. The Admiral's expression changed from skepticism to intense interest as Amy began explaining her research findings. She spoke haltingly at first, but gained confidence as she detailed the cellular breakdown that occurred when hegemony tissue was exposed to liquid water. Admiral Carter asked sharp questions about her methodology and the reliability of her data, and Amy answered each query with the precision of a trained scientist. Jack watched the exchange with growing amazement at the transformation in both women. Lisa had shifted into full command mode and was already thinking through the tactical implications of Amy's discovery, while Amy was demonstrating expertise and knowledge that he had never suspected she possessed. The domestic drama that had seemed so important an hour ago now felt like a trivial distraction from matters of species survival. Dr. Chen, Admiral Carter said when Amy finished her presentation, "Your research will be transmitted immediately to our weapons development teams. We have 4 days before fleet deployment, and if your findings are accurate, we may be able to retrofit our ships with weaponry specifically designed to exploit this vulnerability." Within hours, the entire character of humanity's war effort began to change. Teams of engineers worked around the clock to modify torpedo warheads to carry payloads of pressurized water instead of conventional explosives. Fighter craft were equipped with systems that could deploy clouds of water vapor in combat situations. Even the largest battleships were retrofitted with weapons that could turn the void of space into a lethal environment for hegemony forces. Lisa found herself reassigned from fleet command to strategic planning as military leaders recognized that her connection to Amy Chen made her invaluable for coordinating the new water-based warfare doctrine. Jack threw himself into organizing evacuation logistics with a passion that surprised everyone, including himself, as he realized that his administrative skills could contribute to humanity's survival effort. Amy became the center of a research team that included the most brilliant minds in xenobiology and weapons development. Her modest colonial laboratory was replaced with state-of-the-art facilities and unlimited resources as Earth Central Command finally understood the value of what she had been trying to tell them for months. The change in their personal relationships was equally dramatic. Jack found himself looking at Amy with new respect and admiration as he watched her work tirelessly to provide humanity with the knowledge it needed to survive. She was not just the young woman who had loved him during his loneliness, but a brilliant scientist whose work might save every human life in the galaxy. Lisa discovered that her anger toward Jack and Amy was fading as she focused on the larger battle for species survival. Personal betrayals seemed insignificant compared to the possibility that human civilization might end in 2 weeks, and she found herself working alongside Amy as a colleague rather than seeing her as a romantic rival. The three of them spent long hours in strategy sessions where Amy explained the biological vulnerabilities of different hegemony species while Lisa translated that information into tactical recommendations, and Jack coordinated the logistics of implementing new weapon systems across hundreds of ships. Late one night, as they worked in the command center that had been established in the colonial government building, Jack looked up from his supply requisition forms and spoke to both women. "I need to say something," he began, and his voice was hesitant. 3 days ago, I thought the most important thing in my life was starting over with Amy and leaving behind what I saw as a failed marriage with Lisa." Lisa looked up from her tactical displays, and Amy paused in her analysis of hegemony cellular structures. They both waited for Jack to continue speaking. "I was wrong," Jack said simply. "I was selfish and stupid and blind to what really mattered." Lisa, you have dedicated your life to protecting humanity. And Amy, you have spent years developing knowledge that might save us all. I have been focused on my own petty grievances while both of you are working to ensure that our species has a future. Amy reached across the table and took Jack's hand while Lisa watched with an expression that was difficult to read. We all made mistakes, she said gently. You felt abandoned and lonely, and you reached out for companionship and love. That does not make you a bad person, Jack. It makes you human. Lisa nodded slowly, and for the first time in days, she smiled slightly. We can sort out our personal relationships after we save the world, she said. Right now we have work to do and not much time to do it. The hegemony fleet will be here in 10 days, and we need to be ready for them. As they returned to their work, none of them could have predicted that their personal crisis would lead to humanity's greatest discovery, or that their broken family would become the foundation for a new kind of warfare that would change the balance of power in the galaxy forever.